I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the ideas at the basis of a free society. My guest today is Paul Matzko, who works in tech and abundance at the Institute for Humane Studies. Thanks for coming on, Paul.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, Rob.
All right, so part of the reason I'm having you on is you've written a book called The Radio Right, which is sort of a history of attempts to suppress right-wing talk hosts on the radio, and more broadly, the various sins of the FCC, and that's really the Federal Communications Commission. That's something that's very relevant to today because you wrote about how it being used against the right, but as you know, it's been used against the right and it's been used against the left. It's been used against anybody who uh, angers the powers that be. So currently, so I want to start with what's currently going on, which is the use as FCC by the right under Brendan Carr, who's the new head of the FCC under Trump, who's pursuing what looks like an agenda of putting pressure on and trying to suppress Donald Trump's critics.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There's the saying that, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes.
Hmm.
So in this case, it's just simply repeating, right? There's no rhyming going on. We're just doing the same thing all over again. Yeah, so, Carr is pursuing a pretty aggressive, I guess we could call it an anti-woke agenda using the really quite underrated significant powers of the FCC to target dissident speech. And a lot of people, if you ask, I think a common, liberal or libertarian or someone who cares about free speech, a civil libertarian, that's not going to be the top of their list of concerns when it comes to government authoritarianism. There's so much going on at this moment that Carr's actions at the FCC are kind of skating under the radar, except for people who are, semi-professional FCC watchers and
People like
policy
you and me.
wonks.
Yeah.
Yes, like unfortunate souls like myself who are watching very much and are very alarmed. Um, and there's a couple of mechanisms that he's using to do this. And I think the major theme at the outset here is that most of these measures would or will lose in court. If they're taken to court and challenged, a lot of them are likely to be reversed. But there's a significant, variable there, would or will. There's a lot of companies that are choosing not to challenge these actions in court. It's easier just to settle or to go along, and we can talk about some of those examples. Or it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, if you can tie up a company, a broadcast or internet or big tech platform, if you can tie them up in litigation for years, potentially expensive litigation for years, that itself can have a chilling effect on dissident speech. So you can actually win in defeat. The court case, yeah, you might win it, but it's a Pyrrhic victory. The real consequence was that obligation and the regulatory uncertainty that goes along with it for a number of years. So
There's an old saying that the process is the punishment.
yes, exactly. And Carr gets that. I wrote a piece before the election, back in October of last year, where I said precisely this, that the FCC chairperson, who at the time if Trump won was likely to be Brendan Carr, we knew that in advance, would have massive agenda setting power as the FCC chairman, and could use that regardless of whether or not the rules being set were fair, equitable, or even legal, or would stand up in court, but just the ability to hold hearings and launch investigations would give a lot of informal power to suppress speech that the Trump administration doesn't favor. And that's precisely what he's doing, using things like the news distortion standard, using Section 230, carrot and stick, using anti-DEI measures, looking at mergers between media companies. So there's a lot going on right now, which we can unpack.
Well, yeah, let's do that. Let's talk about the specific examples and the specific powers that the FCC has, which I think you're correct are underrated, possibly even by me.
Yeah. So maybe the first one here, we can talk news distortion. I'll pick it because I think, again, the average person, like if you went through problematic FCC regulations, there's a few that someone who pays attention might have heard about, especially if you're coming from a kind of a right-wing media space. That'd be things like the Fairness Doctrine. People have heard about the Fairness Doctrine, and sure enough, you can think about the Section 230 reform movement as an attempt to revive a Fairness Doctrine standard by another name. But we can get to that.
We
But
can
the
get to that
news
later.
distortion standard, I don't think anyone's heard of that before. And yet, that's the main tool that Carr is using right now to go after essentially media companies that are critical of Donald Trump. So, the specific examples, the Donald Trump during the campaign sued CBS News, demanding $10 billion for an interview that they did with Kamala Harris, saying that it was essentially libelous or slanderous because they edited it in a deceptive way. That was the lawsuit's claim. One of Carr's first actions taking upon occupying the chairman position was to announce an investigation into CBS for news distortion. So what is news distortion? News distortion is supposed to be a very narrow thing. It's supposed to be about essentially fake news. So not misleading news, not inaccurate or even untruthful lying news. It's about news that's staged. So
Ah,
if I were a news journalist and I wanted to demonstrate, a point, I could hire actors and make them pretend to be, rioters, or make them pretend to be a victim of gun violence. I don't know, whatever, right? Like, I'm actually staging it myself.
or find a look-alike to a major politician and
Or
have
find a
him.
lookalike, or potentially in the future use AI, like
Yeah.
generate fake audio of Donald Trump saying something embarrassing, right? That would be news distortion. So it has to be willful, purposeful. There has to be evidence beyond the bright. There's a bunch of standards that are meant to make it very, very narrow. That's not what CBS is doing here. It's not meant to be ordinary editorial control. Like if you record an hour-long interview and you have to cut it down to 10 minutes because that's your time slot in the news, that's not news distortion. And using news distortion to go after that is simply speech control. It's as straightforward as Trump did not like the way in which that interview made his campaign look. Brendan Carr, doing the will of Trump, is trying to intimidate CBS into, and really, it's a
Well, what he's actually trying to
example.
do is to prevent prevent media companies from being able to give positive coverage or positive airtime to any of his political opponents.
Exactly, exactly. It's meant to have a chilling effect. It's meant to be an example pour les autres, example for the others. But it's interesting to me. So this is clearly not news distortion, and again, it's not going to stand up in court. But it might not get to court. CBS, they're signaling that they might settle some version of the Trump lawsuit, or they'll comply with whatever FCC measures are being asked. This is something actually that, well, so they might settle. It might not go to court. If it does, again, could be years of litigation. But what's interesting to me here is that the core idea of news distortion is deeply problematic. So this isn't news distortion, but the entire standard is basically balderdash when you look into it. So the history of news distortion is just one long line of abuse and calumny. It's just been a nightmare. It goes back to the 68 Democratic National Convention. That's the origins of the news distortion standard. And at the time, anyone who was alive in 68, I was not, but if someone was, you'll remember there was student protests outside the Democratic National Convention that summer. Young left Democrats were angry as hell about the Vietnam War, and they were angry that LBJ, who decided not to run because he knew he would lose, polling was not looking good for him, so he pulls out, and his vice president Hubert Humphrey is the heir apparent. He's wildly unpopular. The young left student protesters, they want an anti-war person, Eugene McCarthy. McCarthy wins a bunch of primaries, but primaries are non-binding back then. Back then, conventions still actually matter, unlike
Right.
today. And so the students are all protesting outside of the Democratic National Convention meeting place. And it's huge. It's very embarrassing. If you're a Democratic senator or Democratic, delegate at the convention, this is a nightmare because people still, it was like what the Super Bowl is for culture is what the conventions were for politics. Like people watched it. They,
Oh
they
yeah.
really did matter. And so night after night, they're seeing these mass protests demonstrating how unpopular their party is, and their candidate, because they go with Humphrey over McCarthy. and they're annoyed. So they go to the FCC chairman and they say, "Hey, we think that the coverage is unfair. We don't like how this makes us look. In fact, we think that all those protesters, they're fake. They're crisis actors." That's modern terminology. They wouldn't have said that back then. But I bet you, like, so, the Democratic senator would lodge a complaint and say, that CBS coverage of a protester getting biffed by a police officer, I bet you that was staged. The journalist probably hired the fake protester, had them antagonize the cop, get hit, and then complain, and the blood was faked, and so on. That was one of the first complaints, actually. So the FCC says, okay, and of course the FCC at the time is controlled by a three-person Democratic majority. So they comply with the interests of their party, of the administration. Again, Humphrey is the vice president at the time. And so the news distortion standard was directly created in order to distort the news, not to prevent the distortion of the news, to distort the news. And there's other, funnier examples. It's like there was a story on a local news outlet about Northwestern University students having pot parties. They're smoking the devil's reefer, Mary Jane in their rooms. And Northwestern said, "What, are students doing pot? There's no way. This isn't possible. This must be fake news. We bet that those journalists planted the weed in our good, earnest, righteous students' rooms. This is fake." So they launched the FCC did a investigation. But the point of this was it was PR, right? The university didn't like embarrassing coverage of their students' recreational habits, and this was an attempt to squelch media interest.
And in effect, they wanted to create the narrative that, oh, this is all faked by the media.
Exactly.
Well, another example of this has happened just recently. I find it fascinating how, like you said, this isn't history rhyming. This is history just repeating.
Yeah.
Exactly the same. Down to you use the term crisis actor, which is the term used now by the conspiracy theorists to say, oh, this school shooting wasn't real. These were crisis actors. And this idea, now the crisis actor is the modern term, but this idea that, oh, this was all fake, this didn't really happen. I didn't realize that people had actually made that claim against something so well photographed and well documented as the riots outside the Democratic Convention in '68. But one of the parallels I'm looking at here is what Brendan Carr's doing with NBC, I think it was, where he used news distortion against them, at least the threat of an investigation, because they didn't they chose not to air an a White House press conference about this is the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case, where they threw this poor guy in jail shipped him off to El Salvador to go to jail, and they've admitted it was a mistake. He wasn't supposed to be deported. But after the fact, they're trying to make these claims that, oh, he really was an MS-13 gang member. And the thing is that this is the one, I think this may have been one of the press conferences where they got, and they make a bunch of claims that are clearly untrue or not well founded. And then Brendan Carr complains, well, it's news distortion for you not to air this press conference. Yeah. So it's like, it's news distortion for you not to air our distortions.
Yes. Yeah. We're fully down the rabbit hole at this point where it's, yeah. His quote was, when the truth comes out, they ignore it. Carr is accusing, MSNBC of ignoring it. Comcast, the parent company, knows that federal law requires its licensed operations to serve the public interest. Distortion doesn't cut it. Is taking this. We're at the point where not carrying something is news distortion. It's like the, I think economists like the case where if you don't sell your corn, you're affecting interstate commerce. Yeah. We're like, whoa, at this point, what does anything mean?
or they're really fully going into trying to impact the editorial judgment, because in technical terms in the media, there's a position called assignment editor, and an assignment editor is a person who says, here are the stories we're going to be covering, here's who's going to go do it. And that's an editorial decision to make those decisions about this story we don't think is important, this story we think is important, this news conference that is just same old stuff, we're not going to bother to air it, this news conference is important, we are going to air it. And basically what he's trying to do is appoint the FCC as the assignment editor for the media.
Yeah, and at the margins, it appears to be working. From what, so CBS, which was under pressure for the Kamala Harris thing, they've had multiple staff members, including one of their big producers, Bill Owens, one of the hosts, Scott Pelley, who have spoken out. Some have resigned, saying they're trying to supervise our content in new ways. Right, we're losing independence. We can't do honest journalism anymore, to use some of their phrases, because internally they're preemptively responding to the threat of pressure, right? They're doing the censorship themselves in order to try to facilitate, a positive response from the FCC and from Brendan Carr.
Well,
So, and that's just what we know on the surface. I'm sure, historians 20 years from now will find all kinds of stuff about this kind of preemptive compliance.
yeah, yeah. Well, one of the CBS case thing is particularly interesting because the parent company there is Paramount, and they're trying to arrange a big merger with a well-funded, deep-pocketed other media company that they're trying to do a merger with. And Sherry Redstone, who's the CEO, or I think the chair, not the CEO, but the chairman of Paramount, but primary owner of Paramount, is really they've been working for years to try to make this merger work. But one of the things they have to do is the FTC, another alphabet agency, the FTC has to approve this merger. And to do that, they have to get the FCC to basically say, yes, all the broadcast licenses for the individual CBS stations, these will all be transferred over. It's in the public interest to transfer these over to the new company. And so this is a choke point that the FCC has, so they can hold that leverage. Maybe we won't approve this, and we can spike this big merger you've been working for years on. That's probably Sherry Redstone is looking at as her big payday to liquidate her position. And the thing is that it was after that. This is Bill Owens at 60 Minutes, the big producer of 60 Minutes, quit. One of the things he said is that that came out is they were trying. They had aired something that Trump didn't like. And so Sherry Redstone was basically saying to them, well, let me know in advance about any other news segments you're going to be airing that might anger Donald Trump. So it's, again, this idea that you have this preemptive thing going down from above saying, don't do anything that will anger the authorities because they can block us. They have
Right.
this choke point.
There's billions of dollars on the line, and yeah, you can see the natural incentive to comply. I'm also reminded, there is an element here of what I call the shoe on the other foot test, which is when you create regulatory apparatus, always think about the ways that can be weaponized against you and yours, and not only about the ways you and yours can use it against them and theirs. And so, the last time news distortion made it into the news, though obviously not as big as this moment, but was about a year or two ago, when a group of essentially never Trump Republicans, in this case, Bill Kristol, worked with something called the Media and Democracy Project to file news distortion complaints against local affiliates of the Fox network. So Fox News, cable company, it doesn't have a license, right? You don't license cable. You do license local stations. And so Fox has local affiliates who mostly do their own stuff. They have a lot of editorial independence. There's some controversy around that, but they are licensed. So they wanted to file news distortion complaints against the local affiliates, challenging their right to have their licenses renewed, because Bill Kristol, Media and Democracy Project, were upset, understandably so, with the 2020 election stealing claims from the Trump campaign. And so they decided to use news distortion as their leverage to, there. And now the shoe's on the other foot. Now it's the Trump administration using it against any kind of dissent, whether, conservative Republican or Democratic. And so, be careful the tools that you pick up and leave lying around, because someone else might find a way to use it and use it even better than you were able to. So yeah, really, a really problematic history here.
So, well, speaking of the history, I'd like to go back even deeper in the history, because you mentioned the networks themselves. They're networks. They're a nationwide organization. They are not. They are not licensed. It's the individual stations that are licensed. But it's interesting you see these things that the press has never been licensed in this country. You've never had to have a license to have a printing press, and cable isn't licensed. It's just the broadcast industry. So, I want to go back into the history of how it is that the FCC got this power. and specifically how they got this public interest requirement in.
Yeah, so it's the original sin of broadcasting, essentially. And what it ended up leading to, we have a two-tier system of civil liberties when it comes, and of the First Amendment when it comes to the U.S. There is print and everything based on print, and that includes the internet, which is essentially based on the print metaphor and precedents. And then there is broadcasting, and your First Amendment protections in broadcasting are just quite simply much diminished by comparison to print. And a lot of that goes back to in the 1920s when kind of radio really fully goes commercial. Our first commercial radio stations are established. Millions of Americans start listening to it. And we have a functioning system, and they're not licensed at the time. You don't have to go to the government and say, hey, I want to operate a station broadcasting at this frequency in this area, this power. You didn't have to get permission to do that. What was very rapidly evolving in the mid 1920s was a system, essentially a spectrum rush, that there's like, hey, there's no radio station serving this community. I'm going to start broadcasting on this spectrum at this power in this area.
Yeah, and what you frequency, 92.5.
Yes, 92.5 or whatever, his FM. I don't know, I grew up listening to. But the But the problem is, and as then people would register, essentially they would go to the Commerce Secretary who had oversight authority at the time and say, hey, I've got this slot. Is there anyone else in this slot? No one else is in this slot. Okay, it's mine. So it was essentially people were snagging bits of the spectrum, popping up very organically all around the country. And it worked because if you were infringing on someone else's spectrum, well, first of all, your signals would knock each other out. So you both lose. There's an incentive to cooperate. Then also there's this registry. So you knew who was on what spectrum, what power, what place. And also this started being adjudicated by courts. There were a number of court decisions in the 1920s that said, hey, you got there first. You have the right and you can litigate against someone. So we had this very emergent, spontaneous order that worked quite well. But if you're Herbert Hoover, who's then the Secretary of Commerce before he became a bad president, he doesn't like this because he's a progressive. He's a progressive Republican. He doesn't like the fact that you have all these, weirdos on the airwaves, people who are not progressive, people who are non-native, immigrants, people speaking other languages, black people. You get on the list, anyone who's a minority or doesn't fit the kind of,
and there were radicals. I think you had as a station where the call letters were was it EVB,
Eugene Victor Debs. Yeah, exactly.
EVD, Eugene V. Debs, who was the socialist candidate. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a big station in New York City, which also broadcasted in, I think they were in the, trying to remember in not in Hebrew, in
Yiddish.
Yiddish. They also did a lot of Yiddish broadcasting. So like two strikes. They're socialists and they're not, broadcasting in English, which was a big concern of the of Hoover's at the time.
Well, and this is a sideline, by the way, because Hoover was a major progressive, and we think of the progressives as being these far left people who like immigrants, and the progressives at that time were highly conformist and very much in favor. We have to have all these immigrants coming in. We have to socialize them. We have to assimilate them. So they were very much against foreign language broadcasting.
Exactly. To be a progressive at the time also meant things like supporting boarding schools for Native Americans where they would be forced to integrate, or support, a lot of stuff that we now identify as being far right was actually part of the progressive movement at the time for interesting reasons. So Hoover doesn't like this spontaneous emergent order that was diverse, that was politically radical, that, this is horrifying. So he purposefully deep sixes the system by yanking the Commerce Secretary's, ledger, their kind of roster of what stations there are, and refusing to be involved at all in any of these enforcement disputes. So you get predictable chaos. Because of that, it was manufactured chaos on the airwaves. And then that allows him to swoop in and say, well, I'm going to save the day from the problem that I created. And licensing was essentially the response, because then you have to go to the FCC and prove, you don't just take it because it's there and turn it into something your community wants to hear. Now you have to prove to a board of unelected, eventually first Federal Radio Commission commissioners and then Federal Communication commissioners, people that Hoover selects at the time. You have to prove to them that you deserve this now public commons, this public resource.
Yeah.
You don't own it. The public owns it, which really means the state owns and controls it functionally and lets you doles it out a little bit at a time. And so the airwaves, as a result of the licensing system, becomes much less diverse. It also creates an incentive towards consolidation, the creation of the big radio networks, CBS, NBC, so on. Because they're better able to, rent seeking. They're better able to organize their interest, hire fleets of lawyers and lobbyists, and convince the FCC, may pay off a congressman over here or there to put pressure on the FCC to give them the license rather than the little, Eugene Victor Debs Yiddish speaking station in New York City, right? So the whole thing, like that's the original sin of this system. Now, the justification for it's interesting. Because you're right. Like if you tried to apply this to newspapers, it'd be very intuitively obvious that this is a violation of the First Amendment. If the government said, hey, if you want to operate a newspaper in the United States, you have to first get a license from the government, and we'll decide whether or not your newspaper serves the public interest. It must be in English. It must not be politically radical, i.e. too far right, too far left. It must be not anti-administration. It must be, keep going down the list. We'd be like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's what the First Amendment is very much about.
And by the way, the specific phrase, as I recall, is the public interest, convenience, and necessity.
That's right.
So I try convincing a bureaucrat that not only is it in the public interest for you to be able to say what you want, but it's convenient for them and it's necessary. That's even more opportunities for them to say no.
Well, we get that too. Like this applies, when a hospital wants to open up in an area, they have to get a certificate of need. They have to go to a bureaucrat and say this area. You have to prove that this area needs it. And I think the liberal says, wait, we have to prove why we need hospitals? What are you talking about? Like that we don't need the bureaucrat to decide this. The market can decide this. Well, imagine how much more so here. It has to be the public interest, necessity, or convenience, right? Like this is convenient for the public. Like, what are you talking about? Why do we, right? So that language is open to a lot of abuse because it's also really ambiguous. What is the public interest? Whose public interest? What public? Is the public a homogenous, singular thing? What does that mean? And so it's a ambiguous, constantly shifting target, which is ripe for abuse. And we see that throughout the history of the period.
Well, I do want to talk about that very briefly because you wrote it. I think you co-wrote a really interesting thing a number of years ago, which is this. I think for the Knight Institute, was it?
Yes, First Amendment. Yep.
Yeah, and it was a history of taking out a bunch of different cases that have happened. One that fascinated me was a guy named Bob Schuler, Fighting Bob Schuler, I think it was, who was an evangelical preacher on the radio in Los Angeles. Now, the funny thing is there's a later, my era, I remember I think it's Robert H. Schuler, who was a
Crystal Cathedral,
that guy. He's much later. This is Bob P. Schuler, earlier guy in the 1920s, broadcasting in Los Angeles. He was kind of this, not only an evangelical preacher, but he was a muckraking guy. He was a crusader and got did this campaign against the mayor, and the mayor he didn't get reelected because of this campaign about corruption, official corruption. And then the people that he basically swept out of office as a broadcaster then ganged up on him under this new system. I think it was called the Federal Radio Commission before the FCC. And basically got his license pulled. They had his old legal battle, but they basically got his license pulled because he was a muckraking journalist who was or he's muckraker who was causing problems for the powers that be. Yeah,
my favorite Schuler story is that he went and staked out the chief of police. Now, mind you, this is Prohibition era, so notionally they're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be enforcing alcohol restrictions at the time, but he goes and stakes out the chief of police and finds him coming out of a speakeasy with two women who aren't his wife, and then broadcasts it the next morning on the radio. And he was like the most listened to political commentator in Los Angeles in the 1920s. And so that's the kind of stuff he was doing, which we would just identify as like, that's just journalism, following a public figure and reporting on their criminal actions. Like,
you think what kind of monkey business he's up to?
That's right, exactly. So he was doing, investigative journalism functionally. But yeah, no, he became very unpopular with the local power elites. And there was a lot of money. Los Angeles, this is pre-Hollywood, really, or very early days of Hollywood. This is when Los Angeles was an oil country, actually. So there was lots of money slushing around, bribes, very corrupt city government. Even by the standards of today, which I'm not sure Los Angeles is a shining star in this regard, but it was worse in the 1920s. Um, but yeah, no, and what's I think striking about the Schuler, so that case, whether or not he's going to be forced off the airwaves by angry local politicians, essentially, uh, at the FRC, the predecessor of the FCC, they're going to repeal his license because people are complaining about him. Uh, that case, Trinity United Methodist Church South versus FRC, well, they basically say, yeah, this justifies, it's the big case that justifies federal control of broadcast licensing. At the same time, the same year that that decision is made, and it expressly allows speech control because they're saying we're removing this license because his speech was defamatory, it was slanderous of these poor Los Angeles area politicians. He's defaming their character. How dare he? We're going to remove his, so it's speech-based restrictions. Is the same time we have a very important case, if you know anything about the jurisprudence on First Amendment jurisprudence, near v. Minnesota, where the state government shuts down the newspaper, an act of prior restraint because they don't like their coverage of the state government. And that in that case, they side the court side with the newspaper and say this is the First Amendment. They have a right to say stuff that's critical of politicians. And so again, we see the divergence of these two tracks. One in which you have broadcasting, where there is a diminished First Amendment right, where it's not going to be protected by the courts, where speech can be controlled, and one of the newspapers, which are evolving. Eventually we get to New York Times v. Sullivan, but you have this trail of enhanced First Amendment protections and so on. So we have a two-tier system of the First Amendment in the United States, depending on the medium.
Right, right. Well, one other example, I mentioned this briefly and then go on to something else, which is from there that you talked about JFK, or sorry, not JFK, but FDR.
Yeah.
One of the things he tried to do is he tried to keep newspapers from buying radio stations. And it was because he viewed the newspapers as hostile to him and viewed radio as a more friendly medium. So he's kind of, this is where you have the two tiers, but in a way you can't, that's artificial differentiation. You can't keep it because he can say, oh, I don't like the newspapers. They're really critical of me. I don't want them opening radio stations so they can be critical of me on the radio. Radio is a more friendly, I do my fireside chats. Radio is a more friendly medium to me. I want to keep it that way. So it's fascinating how all along, none of this is new and has been going on pretty continuously.
Yeah.
But I want you to talk about I don't want to get all into that.
Yeah.
Because that's a whole other detail. But maybe let's talk about Kennedy and Nixon.
Yeah, so Kennedy and Nixon. So we have a great case study how this is a bipartisan problem, right? This is not just Dems or Republicans, it's both. So Kennedy realizes that there's this little kind of neglected statute. It's not even a statute. It's really just a doctrine generates administrative law. The FCC had created this thing called the Fairness Doctrine in 1949, and they kind of reiterated it in 1959. But the thing was never really enforced prior to the 1960s. So it's lying around. Now, if you're Kennedy, you're facing a situation not like FDR, which is that you've got a bunch of sympathetic media organizations in one medium. For FDR, it was radio, but newspapers were critical. For JFK, it was kind of switched. For JFK, the newspapers were friendly to him, but radio was critical because of the rise of small independent station ownership. So the networks, CBS, NBC, they're moving on to TV by the 1960s. That's where the money is. But new radio stations are still being added, but they're non-network. And so basically, once again, kind of radical politics are able to kind of come back into the news space because of that. So you just have to you're a local car salesman, and so you buy a radio station to advertise your local cars. Well, you need content, and so you're willing to, whoever will pay you, you'll take their content. So if you're a right-wing radio broadcaster, hey, sure, your money's as green as anyone else. And so suddenly there's this, in the late 50s and early 60s, there's a wave of right-wing broadcasters building massive national audiences by buying time on individual independent stations. And just for a sense of scale, the top guy in the early 60s was a guy named Carl McIntyre. He's a Presbyterian minister out of New Jersey, of all places. And he builds a network of like 460 stations across the nation, reaching 20 million people a week, which, for sake of comparison, that's as many as Rush Limbaugh in the
Yeah.
2000s.
Right.
And
With
everyone
a
gets
much larger U.S. population.
much larger U.S. population. So per capita, a larger audience than Rush Limbaugh. Though he's somewhat forgotten today. So if you're JFK, that comes out of nowhere. You've got things kind of wrapped up. The newspapers are friendly to you. The big TV networks are relatively friendly to you. But there's these irritating grassroots conservative broadcasters who are constantly attacking you on the airwaves. And a group of Kennedy administration allies, the Ruther brothers, Walter and Victor Ruther, who have in the labor union movement, they put together a document saying, "Hey, if you want to win re-election in '64 and you want to win the midterms in '62, what you got to do is just squelch these conservative broadcasters. How do you do it? Well, hey, there's this thing called the fairness doctrine. So if we now notionally, the fairness doctrine is meant to be if you air like political content on one side, you have to air responsive content. Like you have to give both sides of an issue. And we'll set aside the fact that like how many issues are actually just two sides. We'll pretend that there's only two sides to an issue, but you have this obligation to present both sides in a fair and balanced manner. But what if you only enforce this thing called the fairness doctrine against one side's unbalanced speech? It can be a really effective tool. So whenever there's unbalanced conservative speech, you complain and threaten their license. If there's unbalanced, liberal speech, well, you don't worry about it, right? Like,
Or you regard the mainstream liberal speech as, well, that's uncontroversial.
Uncontroversial.
We don't need another side to that.
Right. So support for Kennedy's New Frontier agenda or LBJ's Great Society, that's not controversial. That doesn't need offsetting coverage, right? Only radical right speech needs offsetting coverage. So they recommend, hey, use this thing called the fairness doctrine to go after these guys. And I found in my books about us uncovering that campaign. In fact, there's an a smoking gun Oval Office tape where Kennedy discusses using the FCC and the fairness doctrine and the IRS and tax exempt status to go after right-wing broadcasters. And it works. And I tell that story. It's the most successful episode of government censorship that almost nobody has ever heard of until now. You listening here, you know about it now.
or those who have read your book. Those who have read your book.
That's right. Yeah. So it's really quite remarkable. It gets continued then. So Nixon, Kennedy dies, is assassinated. The campaign continues not under direct presidential White House control, but under the auspices of the Democratic National Committee. And that's another part of the story. But then Nixon comes in office, and Nixon sends Chuck Colson. He's unhappy with their coverage of the Vietnam War, which is not going well by this point in the late 60s. And he sends Chuck Colson to CBS to say, hey, we don't like the way you're making the president look. This is pre-Pentagon Papers, but even then the coverage was not sympathetic. Right. And then threatened, if we'll do to you what Kennedy did, but we'll go after the networks, not just after the small independent conservative guys. We'll use fairness doctrine complaints to go after the big guys, the big guns. And Chuck Colson reports back to Nixon and says, hey, they were like positively cordial is the word he uses when I brought up the threat. And they were like, sure. We'll cover you more kindly in the future. So the use of Kennedy created a stick that Nixon was able to abuse to try to swing the coverage to be more favorable. He also did stuff like FDR did with the cross media ownership, not allowing newspaper owners to buy FM radio stations because he didn't like the way they would cover him. Nixon did the same kind of thing. He tried to squelch the Watergate scandal by going after Katharine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post, and threatening to take away her TV stations because of a cross-media ownership ban, to try to convince her to back off. And to her credit, she didn't, and paid a price. She had to switch out her TV stations because of these new rules. But so once again, then Nixon, FDR, JFK, it's not a party thing. It's a power thing.
Right. And like you said, every time one of these things is out, it creates a tool. It's this tool sitting around waiting to be grasped by whoever gets back into power first. I mean, there's an old Nat Hentoff in the 90s wrote a book called Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee, which sort of named the attitude most people have. And people get this attitude that I'm always going to be in power, right? When I'm in power, I'm always going to be in power. It's going to be permanent. And so therefore I can create all these tools and use them. And somehow I'm never going to get voted out, and nobody else is going to have access to this.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I found all this documentary evidence for my book was because there were a bunch of old Kennedy operatives who were abusing this power. And then Nixon did it, and they were like, oh, crap. We didn't think that the other side would do it too. And so they were willing to talk. There was a CBS newsman named Fred Friendly who wrote a book that touched on some of this, and I went through his files. And they essentially were willing to talk to him because they realized, oh, maybe this wasn't a good idea. We opened the door to we really opened Pandora's box here.
So it's interesting that the fairness doctrine is, similar again to the public interest. What's fairness? What's the public interest? And these vague standards are what invites abuse, because there's not an objective criteria. You could, because the whole problem of licensing is a license implies permission.
Yeah, right.
And it's not that abusive if you could say, well, look, we have to issue this license as long as you hit these objective criteria, because then anybody could just meet those objective. You have to have a certain amount of money. You could maybe make those criteria in a way that would favor some people and not others, but there still be something objective. But when you have the public interest and fairness, you have something so vague that it can be just used, interpreted however you feel like.
And now in this case, Carr, is using the public interest. Like they were slow rolling the Verizon Frontier buyout with fiber optic company. It was a $20 billion merger, and Carr announced an investigation saying that their DEI programs, their corporate DEI programs, well, those were clearly not in the public interest. Ergo, we're going to hold up the merger. So once Verizon agreed to drop its DEI programs, well, now suddenly it is in the public interest, which in an interesting way, this is the flip. So in the 1970s and 80s, progressive activists used the public interest to justify taking stations because they had insufficient racial representation on the airwaves.
Not enough DEI.
Like the case of, they had insufficient DEI. Now the same exact standard is being used to say you have too much DEI, which is again a reminder of why these are very crude tools that invite abuse. And really, I mean, from a liberal perspective, that's why we shouldn't have these powers in the first place and grant them to unelected bureaucrats.
Well, so the other thing I would talk about, last thing I would talk about is, FCC, you talk about the two tracks, and FCC does have limited power because it's about broadcast. And for a lot of the 20th century, broadcast was, and into the 21st century, broadcast was the dominant medium for reaching people. But now, maybe it's not as dominant. With the internet, maybe social media, maybe TikTok, things like this are perhaps more dominant. But I think that brings me to Section 230, which is this last gasp of how can we take some of these powers the FCC has and try to foist them onto the internet.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, Section 230 really it's all those old conversations about the fairness doctrine just being relitigated in a new medium. Because if you think about what the fairness doctrine at its core is, you recognize people are going to speak about controversial issues of public importance, to use the terminology, like current events, politics, but you want them to do it in a measured, balanced kind of way. Well, how do you do that? If you leave it up to the platforms, in this case, the outlets for broadcasting, well, maybe they'll use that to promote conservative politics. And you don't like that if you're the Kennedy administration. So you're going to use the fairness doctrine to require them to carry speech that you do like. So in the way, the fairness doctrine was a kind of semi-common carrier standard. You must carry speech that I like, not only speech I don't like. Section 230 reform is very similar in the sense that Section 230 creates a shield for online internet platforms, in this case, to carry or not carry the speech that they want. They don't want Nazis flooding your Facebook feed, so they moderate away the Nazis or the tankies or whoever, right? Like this is, again, it's not one partisan.
For those out there who are blessed with not knowing this, tankies are like far left people the term came after, these are the people who would cheer on the Russian tanks as they're coming into Prague or Hungary
or Prague, Prague Spring. So, radical left, radical right in this kind of case. So Section 2. So there are people who don't like the fact that these platforms are removing conservative speech. And by maybe I shouldn't even say conservative, right-wing speech, because it's complicated. Is Stormfront or articles from the neo-Nazi website Stormfront, is that conservative? No. Is it right-wing? Yeah, kind of maybe in the way. But anyways, there are people who are unhappy when platforms remove right-wing speech. And so they're pushing to reform Section 230. We can talk more about what that is. But the reason why they're pushing to reform it is because Section 230 gives these platforms the clear, unambiguous right to moderate their platforms as they choose, to carry the speech that they choose. And they don't like that. They want it to carry speech that they prefer instead. The platform shouldn't get to decide. I should get to decide. And now I have power. Brendan Carr's on my side. We'll let him decide what speech these platforms must carry. So it's, again, the kind of a common carrier requirement.
Yeah.
We don't like the liberal tilt of speech on Facebook or on Google or on TikTok or whatever. We're going to force them to carry more right-wing speech.
Yeah.
So again,
what power does the FCC actually have over that? Because I know they don't.
None.
Yeah.
They don't. So Section 230, the call for Section 230 reform from Brendan Carr, and he wrote about this in his Project 2025 essay, which you might have heard of coming out of the Heritage Foundation. It would be a novel right for the FCC. They've never had, no one has the right, because that decision was made by congressional statute, not given to a federal agency. And Section 230 just says, hey, you're an internet platform. You are not liable for someone else's speech.
It's about liability in the courts. So it's really Congress
civil
and the
liability
courts that are involved in this. Yeah.
Exactly. So it doesn't require an agent. That power was not delegated to some agency to oversee. It's a court thing to be adjudicated. It creates clear, bright lines for court cases. So he's claiming a really remarkable power for the FCC. Other proposals prior to Carr, Josh Hawley pitched a bill that would have vested this power in the FTC, but it's similar problems because it's an invitation to abuse. When in Carr's essay calling for this, he cited a solo concurrence from Justice Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court from back in 2021, who wanted to, quote, prohibit discrimination against core political viewpoints. And that's the giveaway word right there, core. Because what is core and what isn't core is in the eye of the beholder. And you're giving that power to someone. Is it Brendan Carr? Is it the FTC? To decide that your speech is core and thus must be carried, but your speech is not core and thus doesn't have to be carried. And that's just an invitation to partisan weaponization of this power.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, the attraction is always, again, free speech for me, but not for thee, we're going to be in power. And maybe the attraction is we're going to be in power. We're going to use this aggressively, and then therefore ensure we will always be in power.
Yes. Well, that's the nightmare scenario of no longer. It's like, as long as we have a democratic society, the other side will get to use the power as much as your side does over the long durée. Or the alternative is you might be right and you always will stay in power, and then we don't have a democracy anymore. And that second scenario seems less and less unlikely as we go forward here.
And actually, I mean, it seems like, this is something that the thing that disturbs me most about the Trump administration is that a lot of them are acting as if we will always be in power, which kind of implies that now maybe they're just being incredibly foolish and not realizing they're not always going to be in power, or that is what they think is actually going to happen. That is their actual goal, is to make it so that they can never be put out of power.
And that's the worst case scenario. But even the best case scenario is bad. The best case scenario is that both sides abuse this power back and forth. And the effect is a chilling effect, where platforms just become wary of carrying any kind of controversial content. So imagine a completely anodyne walled garden where politics never comes up. You could have a social media platform like that. Or also, if you remove Section 230, there's a chance you'll get some walled gardens with basically boring apolitical walled gardens, or you'll get more of the internet will look like 4chan, like these radical platforms where there is no content moderation and you're just constantly encountering Nazis and communists and really unpleasant people, because that's another way of avoiding civil liability. But so in other words, a worse internet, worse communications, less freedom.
And also with the more mainstream things that you would get a blandification. where
Yes.
everybody was to. I mean, I think I actually see that already happening a little bit
Mhm.
with some of the big newspapers and some of the big television news things that you get this sort of their Trump will do something outrageous and their New York Times, their reporting of it will put it in this very soft anodyne terms, and I think it's the same thing. They're afraid of the retribution, so they're trying to not state things in even when an inflammatory terminology would be totally objective and warranted, then they're stating it in less inflammatory
Yeah,
terminology.
that's right.
So how would we reform this? And what's the reform that's needed? I mean, does it just because you have to have I love the idea of let's just go back to excuse me a registry for spectrum and not have the government owning the airwaves or the government giving licenses, but at the very least would we get rid of the public interest requirement?
So, yeah, trying to think practically here. Yes, I'm all in favor. I think we should follow the example of the spectrum auctions from the 1990s. The reason why we all have amazing, smartphones and so on, Wi-Fi in your houses is because we took parts of the spectrum that were, reserved for the public and we sold them. The government sold them on private property and they're being better used, more
And
efficiently
by the
used.
way, part of this history, as I'm sure you know, is that there's this fiction created that, oh, we have a scarcity. There's a limited amount of the spectrum.
Right,
And
right.
it's a lot less limited than they claim. That scarcity was sort of the excuse to say, therefore, the government has to distribute it.
Exactly. It was always a lie too. We have never reached the technical limit on the number of stations, not even come close, not even in the 1920s or 30s. So it was always a legal fiction, not reality, and especially not true now, right?
And so the idea is you do what they did in the 1990s. We've got all the spectrum we're not using. Let's auction it off. Let's
Right.
help people find auction it off so that people then find commercial uses for it.
And this is a very old idea. There was a economist named Coase who back in the 1950s proposed spectrum auctions. And honestly, we should auction off not just unused spectrum, but used spectrum. Because when you turn something into private property, they tend to use it for a higher use, a better use, a more efficient and productive use. So, but yes, I recognize that that's not, a high political likelihood because that's a rat's nest. Because, once the government's involved, there's lots of vested interests in that not being the case. So,
Yeah,
it's
I'm in
unlikely to happen.
Virginia where we still haven't been able to get rid of the ABC stores. So you have to
Yeah, you can't.
you can't buy liquor from a store. Yet they like a state monopoly on selling liquor, dating back to the to prohibition. Yeah.
Yeah, government inefficiency has inertia on its side. But but absent that, I mean, this is the time to think big because we're coming close. 2027 is the 100th anniversary of the FRC, the original kind of federal regulation of the airwaves. And so on the 100th, what should we do? And I think, the core thing I would push for, even if you remove the public interest standard, there's still a lot of ways in which it's a justification for arriving at these bad regulations like the news distortion standard or fairness doctrine or so on. You don't necessarily need the public interest standard to do those things anymore. They have their own inertia. They've been around for a while. If you just repealed the public interest obligate, a convenience or necessity, that terminology, I'm not sure any of that goes away. But what I do think we need is a more independent FCC. And this is something I think is actually achievable and practical. So notionally, the Federal Communications Commission is supposed to be an independent agency. It's supposed to be insulated from the government tampering with the speech rights of broadcasters. Because when it was set up, they recognized this could be a problem. This is what authoritarian nations do. They kind of capture the airwaves and, for the megalomaniacal dictator. So it's supposed to be insulated, but it's actually not nearly as insulated as it could be, or even as other independent agencies. So, like, I think it should be reformed, and this it'd be a congressional statute to make it more like the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve, it has things like longer terms. So the current term of a FCC commissioner should be at least double. Let's say go from 5 years to 10 years.
Yeah.
Make it a longer term so that your term is going to overlap multiple presidencies and likely presidencies from multiple parties. You're a little more insulated in that case and less able for one authoritarian minded president to be able to replace the entire commission or most of the commission. Another thing is that the FCC chairperson, unlike the Federal Reserve chairman, the FCC chairperson, they serve at the whim of the president. They do not have to go through Senate confirmation, and the tradition is that as soon as the new president takes office, the old FCC chairman comes out and their pick comes in. Well, note how different that is from the Federal Reserve, where
Yeah.
Jerome Powell is still ticking along for another year or two here, even though it annoys Donald Trump. Now, imagine what would happen if he put one of his flunkies in office and was manipulating interest rates like he is tariffs. It'd be an absolute nightmare. So I think we should, again, make the FCC chairman Senate confirmed. It helps screen out some of the craziest options, and also, give them a longer term as well, so they are not immediately being replaced. You also get, on the plus side, beyond the insulating it from partisan weaponization, it would also create kind of policy stability, which is, I think, useful for those who follow like the net neutrality debates. You get whiplash swinging back and forth every couple of years. New FCC chairperson. Oh, now we're against net neutrality. Now we're for it. Now we're against it. Now we're for it. That's bad for business. It's bad. It's just inefficient way of doing policy. You want durable policy decisions. So it's also good just on the merits for like state capacity concerns to have a little more. So that's what I would do. I would take measures to insulate the FCC to make it more truly independent. And I think that's the best thing we could do in this arena.
Well, there is actually a push by the Trump administration to say is no such thing as an independent agency, and maybe that brings us to the bigger constitutional issue. So that's the last thing I'm going to throw out here is, which I've been asking everybody, is especially in light of recent events, what is the one thing, if people would listen to you and say, yes, we should do this, what's the one constitutional amendment that you
Does
would
it need to be
propose?
about the FCC? I'm not sure we need a constitutional amendment for the for.
It doesn't have to be with the FCC. It can be about anything.
Okay, about anything. Okay, well, I'd probably go with the 22nd Amendment. So, which is the limitation of presidents to 2 terms.
Yeah.
So that was passed. Why was that passed? Well, that was passed in the aftermath of FDR, winning 4 elections and then dying in office. And they recognized, oh, this is a problem. If you have one executive to serve that long, they can accrue so much power that, like, if FDR had been wired a little bit differently. Now, I myself think he abused his power quite significantly. He tried to pack the Supreme Court and so on.
But he could have been worse.
He could have been even worse than he was. If he had been, just had a different temperament and been even more authoritarian. People recognize that, like, this is a problem. We need to reduce the power of what we now call the imperial executive by limiting how many terms he serves. But let's do that again. If we go from 4 for FDR down to 2 for everyone else, let's take it from 2 to 1. So I would, if I just had my way and I could just rewrite the 22nd Amendment, I would make it a single term. So every president is immediately a lame duck president. And what that would do functionally is shift power. It would push power from the imperial executive back towards the legislature. Now, in a lot of the rise of the imperial executive, the unchecked president, is that Congress has been willingly giving up its power. Like, please, we don't want to make decisions on war. You do it. We don't want to make decisions on tariffs. You do it. And we're seeing, forcing, though, functionally Congress to take more responsibility by weakening the executive is, I think, a good way of rebalancing the 3 branches of government.
Well, as a citizen of the Commonwealth of Virginia, where our governors are term limited to only 1 term, I think I approve of that. All right. So, well, thanks so much for talking to me today and spelling out the history that we are reliving right now.
My pleasure, Rob. It was great.
I'm Rob Tracinski with Symposium. My guest today has been Paul Matzko, who does tech and abundance issues for the Institute for Humane Studies. And we're talking about the FCC and the powers of the FCC and the abuse of power of the FCC. Please like this podcast or subscribe to us on YouTube. And for more ideas and analysis on the nature of free society, go to symposium.substack.com. Thank you for listening.